Hey everyone, welcome to the LinkedIn Presents Redefining Work podcast. I am really excited to share this episode with all of you. If you've been paying attention to social media for the past week or so, you've certainly seen some posts about Index Ventures' new Scaling Through Chaos book and their accompanying team plan app. And I'm thrilled to be joined by two of the architects of that, Sandra Schwarzer and Martin Mignot. And we are going to get behind the scenes into how this resource came together, key learnings, key takeaways, and how to scale your companies more effectively. So we always start off with introductions. Sandra, I'll start with you. I'd love to have you introduce yourself to the audience, and then Martin will come to you next.
Fabulous, and delighted to be here. I lead Index talent team here in Europe, working primarily with our growth founders, so Series B plus, as they're going on their scaling journey, building out their teams, thinking about what is the right org structure for the right time as they're going on this scaling journey. Previously, I was a chief people officer, so I know how hard it is when you're in this people function, actually trying to get the organization to change, trying to hire people and onboard them and make sure that they're performing well in the organization. And delighted to be here with you.
Great.
And Lars, very nice to meet you. Thanks for having us. I'm Martin. I'm one of the partners at Index. In just maybe a few words of Index, we are a multi-stage fund. We've been investing in early stage tech companies for 30 years, originated from Europe, but expanded to the US very rapidly. And today we have an office in London, San Francisco, and New York, where now I'm based. After spending 15 years in London, and I moved to New York to help open the Index office here.
Great. Well, I have so many questions about this platform, and at the end, we're going to share you a link where you can download both the book and access the Team Plan app. But let's just start with key takeaways. Let's just jump right into it. I'd love to get both of your perspective. This is a deeply researched set of resources, indexing over 200,000 career profiles across over 200 companies. And there's a lot of meat in both the book and the Team Plan app. And so let's just start with the gold, key takeaways. Martin, I would like to start with you first. Like, when at the end of this research, at the end of this journey, what were some of the things that surprised you? What were your key takeaways?
Yeah, maybe, I'll get to that. But I think maybe just before getting there, the few things to say. And the first one is really what is this research is about and where it came from. This is actually the fourth book that we publish, and we've created a series that we now call Index Press. And these books and the company and apps have really kind of one goal, and it is to answer the most common questions that the founders we work with, and we work with hundreds of them over the past 3 decades, ask themselves and ask us as investors and very close board members. And so the first book was around compensation, and there was an app called Option Plan, which has been extremely popular, and that helps people design their option plans. And then the second and third books were around international expansion, so from Europe to the US and from US to Europe. And this is our fourth book, and this one is all about org design and just kind of building the team from 0 to 1,000 employees. And as you said, the methodology was to look at the individual career profiles of the first 1,000 employees of the fastest growing 200 companies of the past decade. And also we complemented that with interviews with founders and operators from these companies, about 60 of them. And so the results is this book, if you can show it here, 300 plus pages called Scaling Through Chaos, and the app Team Plan that you mentioned. In terms of the key findings, obviously there are a lot. It's 300 pages of a lot of data, a lot of insights, a lot of interviews, case studies, frameworks. So there's really a lot for founders in there. I think the three top ones that come to mind. The first one is really around, first is the speed of growth and the idea that you really need to embrace the chaos. I mean, these companies we found on average will grow 2x year on year for 4 to 5 years, and that's obviously a very fast pace of growth, and that means that at any given time, of the people around the table, half of them will be new to the company. So it's obviously a very, very rapid pace of change. And this chaos is good in a lot of ways. That's the raw energy, and you don't want to bring processes too quickly and tame it too much. but you need to kind of embrace it and grow with it and progressively bring some framework. And that's what this book helps you do. I think the second one, which was really, which was really surprising, which kind of we knew, but I think the data was interesting, was really around this idea of favoring performance over loyalty. And this is one of the biggest topic that we have as early stage board members, the relationship with between co-founders, the relationship with early employees. That's a very sensitive topic, and that's a very big topic. And what we saw and what the data showed was that of the first 10 employees, by the time the company reaches 50 employees, only 5 will be left. So there's kind of a 50% drop off from 0 to 50 employees, or from 10 to 50 employees for the first 10 employees, which was surprising. In seeing the number, was fairly surprising in the scale and the speed of that happening. And then by the time you get to 1,000 employees, you actually you get close to 2 or 3 max that are left with the company. So what it shows is really the need to realize this is no one's failure. This is no one is responsible for it. This is just part of the natural life cycle of the company. And I think that's something that hopefully will help entrepreneurs kind of have this conversation, prepare for it, plan for it, instead of being reactive to it, seeing it as a failure of their part or the other person's part, and realize that this is the natural thing for their company. It's also potentially the best thing for the early employees or the early co-founders, that who can then move on to go to another company. So those are some of the two most obvious one that came to mind.
Yeah. And Sandra, how about you?
Yeah, I think that the two things I would add on to this is, like, as you're going into high growth mode, you're likely going to double your headcount every single year, which also means half of your workforce will be new every single year. And so you have to spend an extraordinary amount of time thinking through what are the right systems, what is the right communication structure, where is the culture, how do you make sure you maintain that? And for founders and CEOs and their teams, what that means is, like, really deliberately thinking through where they're spending their time on people-related matters as they scale. Early on, I think a lot of founders are surprised you spend about 50% of your time consistently on people-related matters in the early stages, really focused on hiring. But you will still spend 50% of your time, even when you're in a high-growth mode and going towards an IPO and exit or scaling the company. Even more than that, that time stays at 50%. How you spend it changes. And I think the book offers you a lot of different tools and resources on what are some of those people-related questions and org design-related questions, and how have others tried to solve it.
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting too, because I think when you break down a lot of these business problems in early stage companies and challenges, they're actually people challenges. And they're people problems, kind of masquerading as business problems. So usually when you kind of really dig into the origin and the impact, it tends to be people-related issues. And I think that can often be surprising. And the book kind of examines some of those. Martin, I want to come back to you. You mentioned kind of Index Press, and this is the 4th book in the series of content that you've been developing. What was the origin story for this book particularly? Why was it important for you to kind of create this and put this out into the world?
Yeah, like all of those books, they share the same origin story, which is, as I was mentioning, really answering entrepreneurs' most pressing questions, and these questions that come back again and again and again. So that's always the starting point when you really start from the trying to solve the founder's problem. I think the way we do it is a little bit different, and the philosophy behind it is really we want to move beyond the anecdotal and the first-hand experience, which is very valuable. Don't get me wrong, but when typically what happens at the board is what you will have 2 or 3 investors, and they will each share their own experience. They will say, I worked with company X and company Y. Typically, it's 2 or 3 that have been very successful, and they will apply the same recipe and the same learnings from those 2 or 3 companies over and over again, sometimes even kind of regardless of the situation and the business model. And we do it ourselves. It's definitely not a dig on anyone. It's just, this is just the amount of experience that any single individual may have. And there's a lot of value because this is a first-hand experience. And so we don't want to remove that. But what we want to do is augment it with data And that's this huge amount of work. It's been a couple of years of work really, behind the scene to ingest the data, clean the data, normalize the titles, and so on and so forth. There's been a lot of really deep data work that's been happening behind the scene to get to that result. It's really augmented data. And instead of using 2 or 3 personal examples, it's using 200. Or if you want to be more specific, you can, if you use the app, for example, you can select, let's say, you're a SaaS, enterprise SaaS business. You can select a smaller, an enterprise size group of companies to compare yourself against. So, maybe it's going to be 50 or 60, for example, in this data set, but very, very relevant companies. So it's really using that and then using kind of more qualitative data through the interviews to try to get to a definitive or as definitive answer as possible when founders ask questions. So that's really the philosophy behind it. And the key question was also always, should we keep it to ourselves? Should we keep it to our own portfolio companies? Is that kind of core IP? And it is core IP for sure. And it is very valuable to us, to the portfolio. But the reality is, if we want to have an impact on the ecosystem, there are way more companies that are not index portfolio companies than those that are. It will always be the case. And we felt if we wanted to have the maximum impact, the best way to do was to make this data freely available to everyone in the ecosystem.
Yeah, and I want to explore that a little bit more with you, Sandra, particularly with the Team Plan app, because I was fortunate you hooked me up with early access to both, and I remember when I got the first demo of the Team Plan app, I was blown away by the richness of it, but simultaneously I was blown away that you decided to open source that, because Martin, as you mentioned, obviously it's IP. You put a lot of time and research and effort and hours into building this. You could have easily kept this as a competitive, resource for your portfolio companies, but you didn't. You decided to open source it. And, Sandra, I want to get into that a bit more with you, kind of on the Team Plan app specifically. Like, why was it important to make this very rich, kind of valuable resource open source and available for everyone?
Over the past couple of years, every single time we have conversations with founders or with the chief people officers or the chief financial officers actually of the companies, the number one question that comes up is like, do you have any benchmarking data, or do you know where we can find benchmarking data? And it's not available. Nobody has ever done an analysis like this. Nobody has ever looked at the 210 most successful companies and 200,000 profiles of the first 1,000 employees and put them together. And the question comes back all the time. You've just raised your Series A, you have a product roadmap, you think everything is going well, you've got your funding, you have your plan, and the next day your engineering director turns around and goes like, actually, we need 20 more people to make sure that we can deliver. Otherwise, our timeline will be different. So now, for the first time, you will be able to have a tool to say, like, hold on, is that actually true? Like, do we see this shift between a 10 people and a 50 people company, that engineering in a SaaS model all of a sudden goes up or not? Or a founder who turns to a head of people and who says, what's the benchmark of my marketing versus my operations team? And most of the time, they don't know how to answer it. So for the first time now, they can go into a tool and do this. The second question we get quite a lot is like, what happens to internal mobility? Like, how many of the people are actually moving along with us on this journey? And we talked a little bit about the first 10 employees and what happens to them. But we often get the question, should we just promote internally? What's the right ratio of promotion? What's the level you promote to? And chances are, as you grow and scale, you will become much more specialized in your domains and in your functions. You will get external expertise having to come in, so your promotions will go down. But again, the app helps you benchmark. What's the right level of attrition? What's the right level of movement between functions on the inside? And for us, it's incredibly important to make sure that the ecosystem continues to go from strength to strength. Our portfolio companies will benefit from having fabulous organizations that were ahead of them because they can get talent out of them. We'll also have a lot of founders who will learn from other founders and other companies in those circumstances. And I also think like there's a layer of additional expertise that you get in the advisory piece when you're working with us, but it comes back to our core values of wanting to make the ecosystem much better.
Yeah. I think when you look at the both of the resources and through the lens of open source, right? So you have, as both you mentioned, much of these decisions were made anecdotally or based on personal experience. And both of those things are valuable, but they are not, kind of scaled perspective. And that, I think, is what this app specifically does so uniquely. Like the benchmarking across verticals, across company sizes, being able to leverage that is just, certainly for founders, for people leaders, absolutely, because they're often getting those questions. When should we bring on a CFO? When should we bring on a CTO? And you can answer that based on experience. You can answer that based on asking your peers, hey, when did you hire? But I think having the data that they now have access to a team plan is just a very different conversation now that's much more data driven. Martin, I want to come back to you on this question around some of the key learnings, because you in the book specifically, you kind of break down some of the different growth stages. And in one of them, you talk about the messy middle, and you referenced earlier, every 12 to 18 months when you're scaling, you're doubling in size. You're essentially a different company. You're a new company over those periods. And I'm curious to get your perspective. Like when you think about the growth that you've seen, particularly in that messy middle stage, what were some of the patterns that you've identified of companies that have kind of navigated that successfully?
Yeah, I think the messy middle, the way we kind of describe it in the book, is a kind of 75 to 500 scaling, which is a really intense time for the founding team and the founder CEO in a lot of cases. This is the time where we've identified that most of the exec team build out happens. So typically what happens is that things start to break because the CEO can't be everywhere, it can't control everything and has to let go. But there is no exec team yet, so there is no one to really delegate things to in a very structured way. There are no processes, there's no structure, and there is no team. And so that's a time, a moment really when the CEO's time is really stretched to the max, because they need to both now keep doing the job they were doing when they were 75, and they also need to build a team that they need to have by the time they get to 400-500 plus. And so that's really this kind of in most cases 2 years period. These companies are doubling year on year, where the data shows people will hire at least 5 senior execs. And actually, it's probably a little bit more than that, because what happens before that is you have folks who you call senior execs who are not really senior execs. There's a bit of title inflation. So the reality is you probably hire, at least, around 6 senior execs. And the recommendation from the book is never to hire more than 2 at the same time, because it just takes so much time, and both in hiring and then in referencing, calibrating, onboarding. So you have basically a 2-year period where you are hiring at any given time. You're hiring 2 senior exec at the same time while onboarding the 2 that you just hired. So that there's that's, and again, that was kind of one of the point I wanted to make in the first place, was really the time that Sandra made, which was, that's a moment where 50% of your time is spent on hiring, and that's consistent across size of companies. But at that particular stage, that 50% is very much focused on the exec team. And this is really a moment when the CEO needs to find leverage on their own time. And I think that's what really successful companies have done well, and very successful founders have done well. It's interesting. We had, we organized a launch event for the book on Monday at NASDAQ headquarters here in New York City. And we had a slew of incredible speakers that came to share their journey of scaling through chaos. And I was lucky enough to interview Kevin Ryan, who started Ali Corp and what biggest success being MongoDB here in New York City, and Kate Ryder, who's the CEO of Maven. And we talked a lot about how they found ways to leverage their time. And Kate was sharing that. I mean, Kate, for the record, built a company that went from 0 to 1,000 while having 3 kids. Just to give you a sense for the level of intensity and organization that is required. And so she walked us through how she organized an office of the CEO, which is really around a very strong EA, who she's been very close to for a long time, who also helps her with personal matters, which is really important, especially if you're a 3 times mother during that journey while building and running your team. A very strong chief of staff, who's really the person making sure at Maven things run on time, and then decisions are being made, get executed on by the rest of the team. And then she had an amazing chief people officer that she hired when there were about 75 employees instead from 75 to 400 employees, and was really critical in that very important juncture. And so that's something that was echoed by all the speakers, is the importance of finding those expensive hires, or hire that looked expensive at the time turned out to be incredibly cheap, because they really help you navigate from the 75 to the 500 and this really messy middle.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think when you see, certainly over the last couple of years, you've seen companies investing in heads of people or even chief people officers much sooner than they had in the past. I think, go back maybe to the before times, pre-pandemic, and you often found companies that, you'd kind of grow with the HR operating system, if you will, that you had when you were a 50-person company until you get to maybe 250, 300, and that just breaks. And you realize it then, and you're like, oh, wait, now we need a seasoned operator, and they need to come in, they need to rip everything out, they need to replace everything. And it's, that's like the messiest of messy middles. And I think a lot of companies have learned from that. And one of the things the book gets into as well, which I found was really interesting, is the importance of a cultural operating system. And I think when you look at organizations, as we've kind of discussed, you're a new company every 2 years, you have new people coming in, your culture ultimately changes with every single hire you make somewhat. And culture is also not static. Culture changes and shifts and evolves. Values tend to be more of the thing, mission, values, the things that you stand for. Again, coming back to that kind of culture operating system, tend to be the things that are really what you kind of pin everything back to on the people side as you scale and grow. And, Sandra, I'd love to get your perspective on that. When you think about the importance of a cultural operating system, particularly for scaling companies, how do you help founders understand, what that is and why that's important?
It's probably one of the most fundamental things you need to get right, and you can change over time and adapt. So I don't think there are a lot of founders who get this right from the first day. Though, as the book will tell you, there's a number of stories of founders who have on the second or third venture and who have understood how important it is to try and get it as right as possible at the beginning. What we see often, what happens is like it really becomes a conversation at the start of an organization about what are the values we want to uphold in our organization and how do we translate that into those first hires. And tends to be relatively high-level terms that are used, and it tends to be described in ways. As companies scale, you have to be incredibly good at translating what are those values actually showing in the behaviors, or how are the behaviors showing up in the day-to-day. And you decline that by when we interview candidates and when we're looking for certain attributes of how they behave, when we assess them as they're coming inside the organization on their performance review. But you also start thinking about who are the people in this organization who really carry the culture and who embody who we are. And you start, as a best practice, a lot of companies have started doing culture interviews, which are fundamental. They get to say no to people. And actually the expectation on them is that they will say no to a lot of great candidates who might bring the technical expertise or a specific competency the organization is looking for. But there's an element of this culture that is important, especially in the messy middle. When you have half the organization being new all the time, and you maybe have the person with the most tenure in the organization has 2 years or 3 years there, it is incredibly important to figure out who those culture carriers are. And then you kind of embed it in all of your systems, in learning and development, in compensation, in your performance appraisals. And that's when the culture is alive. And what we see in the current market in particular, where great candidates still have a lot of choice of who they want to work for, culture is the number one thing that they bring up and that they assess for in the interviews when they're thinking about, do I want to join this business or not?
Yeah. It's interesting too. I think, we're recording this at a point in time where the conversation around talent density is also, quite out there. Coinbase recently reshifted their policy where Brian is now, their CEO and founder, Brian Armstrong, is reviewing all finalists and helping make a hiring decision, right? And so that kind of gives you a sense of how some companies are beginning to really think, especially in this market, how they're hiring. And again, with the idea that every hire impacts your culture, every individual hire. There's another aspect of the book that gets into the friction of navigating kind of structure versus flexibility. And Martin, I want to get your thoughts on this, because I think particularly for technology companies, when you're scaling your technical teams, how do you find companies, based on the data and the research you've done, are navigating kind of when to have flexibility in terms of how they scale their teams versus when they need more structure?
Yeah, I would just refer people to the, to the details of the book. There is a very long section about product and engineering. I think the high level recommendation from the book is very much to introduce structure, but very fairly slowly and deliberately, and not one of the big risks we see is hiring. Typical mistake that people will make is hire a very senior exec from one of the GAFA typically, and that will bring on processes that they've seen work at when they manage team of 1,000 plus. And bring that kind of process to a team when they will manage, 50 or 100 or maybe 200 engineers, and that obviously that there is a mismatch between those two things, and that can really slow the especially if you talk about product engineering, it can really slow the pace and the velocity of the product and really bring the company almost to a halt. And so I think that's a typical mistake we try to protect against, and obviously again this research is hopefully will help companies and founders when they have to make these decisions of you need to make sure that you right level the seniority of the people you bring so that the structure they bring is just stage appropriate, which is a very, very important concept.
Yeah. I mean, I'm glad you made that point, because I think when interviewing leaders, we often get, excited about people from big brands and well-known companies. And, those companies are successful for a reason, but it doesn't necessarily mean those practices will translate to your environment. So I think when interviewing, you've got to really go deep on, not just kind of their leadership philosophy and how they manage, but how they would take what they've done and what they've learned and apply that to your organization that may be at a different stage. And you've got to vet that in the interview process, because if you don't have that understanding, chances are they may try to port, as you mentioned, what they've done to your environment, and that is not going to work. So I want to get back into another topic that was covered in the book around kind of loyalty versus expertise. And I think that this is such a common, challenge with startups that are going through scale, because you do have that initial team that, kind of were there from the start, we're experiencing all the, the lumps and pains and challenges of being an early stage startup. And then as you scale and grow, there is that sense of loyalty often to those leaders, but they may no longer fit the organization because it's a different organization. It has different needs. It has different challenges to overcome. And, Sandra, I'd love to get your perspective on that. Like how, based on the research and some of the findings, how should, founders specifically kind of be thinking about navigating that loyalty versus expertise dilemma?
It's definitely a very emotionally charged subject because often also you feel like you really have been in the trenches. You've been in the very hard part of starting a business. And as Martin said, a lot of those early hires will not make it through the entire journey. Actually, I think only 2 on average stay until you hit 1,000. Best way probably to ask yourself is like, is this person still going to be able to deliver what we need them to deliver in this role in 18 months? And to really think ahead of that. And it becomes incredibly tricky when loyalty primes whether the person still is the one who's adding all the value to the organization, when it becomes obvious to the rest of the team that somebody is either there because they've been there in the beginning, or worse, they get over promoted and then get put into roles where they're really struggling to achieve, and you have to hire a layer below them that is stronger than, so you're finding it harder to attract the right talent. And so there's a fine balance between the hiring too big too early, and really for us it's about testing who's a builder versus a scaler and making sure that you bring the right people and the right competencies on at the same time. Both Kate and Kevin on Monday made really great comments about how they're recognizing the importance of these early teams. So I think Kate was sharing that when Maven became a unicorn, she invited the first 12 employees of Maven for dinner to celebrate the success because they had laid the groundwork and the foundation. And for Kevin, it was even multiple successes where every year he still brings together almost communities of the starting teams and of those leadership teams that were important at specific times in his journey to celebrate, to stay in touch. And so I think there's this real mechanism you can use to make sure that they're still part of the story and that they continue to be your champions even if they go somewhere else.
Yeah, one of the tips that, and I think what was important is either the Maven dinner, and I think Kevin was saying there was the Guild group. I think it was like a 60 people, I think it was like 60 people senior team from Guild group that he would still invite to his home for dinner once a year. like a decade later or so, right? So, and I think the importance of calling the person back, once they are gone, calling them back a month or 2 months later, once things have settled down a bit, and really reconnect and show care, and keep them within the community and recognize that they will have had this impact that will stay on forever with the company. I think those gestures and just those signs of care are extremely important.
Yeah, I think Sandra, you mentioned community in that, and I think that is so key. It's like the founding team, they have a role in the organization. They're part of that story, and I think for founders that recognize that it may be hard to part with people that you have that loyalty to, but parting with them because they're no longer a fit for the trajectory of the business doesn't mean parting with them as a human, as a person who is involved in setting that up. And that section of the book made me think about Reid Hoffman's tour of duty model that he kind of implemented at LinkedIn and wrote about in the Alliance. And I think, to me, it's the nature of employment is changing, right? We are no longer being hired for jobs that we're going to have for the next 5 years. And I think that LinkedIn has done a really great job of kind of hiring people in basically 2-year increments and being very clear about that. Here's what you're going to get from this experience. Here's what we're going to get from your skills. And in 2 years, we're going to reassess. Maybe it's right for you to continue being in this role. Maybe it's not. Maybe you've outgrown us. Maybe we've outgrown you. Maybe there's another role in the business that we can move you to that'll be a better fit for your interests and skills. And I think just having that transparent, open conversation with employees is really the model that we need to be thinking, about work these days. And again, it gets us in the situation, particularly for startups, where if you do outgrow that person, they're not necessarily expected they're going to be in that same role along for the ride the entire time. Martin, I want to come back to you on a topic that certainly I think is front of mind for everybody right now, which is generative AI and its impact on the workforce. And I imagine this is something that both of you think about extensively, as do your portfolio companies, as does anybody who's listening to this podcast. But I want to get specifically into how that maybe impacts some of the findings and thinking that you have at Index around scale. We're recording this, in the recent future. We saw Klarna release, how they're using AI to replace customer service agents, cognition on software engineers. We're certainly seeing aspects of how this is impacting, different functions, even in our field in HR, from scheduling to sourcing and more. So when you look out, I can't put too long of a horizon on this because that's not fair, but let's look at maybe like a year or two. What kind of conversation do you think we're having around how founders are thinking about scaling from 0 to 1,000 as they will now have access to more and more of these AI tools that can take on some of the work that humans currently do?
Yeah, and it's a very interesting topic, and one that we get asked about, quite a lot, as you mentioned. A few things here. The first one is what's interesting with this data is that we can update it very easily, and the plan is very much to keep it fresh and alive, and update it with the new sets of companies that keep on growing. This is not the final 200 company set. We're going to keep on adding them as more companies grow. And obviously, I could totally foresee next year or in 2 years have a new analysis being released around AI companies or AI first companies, or they're growing differently, or is their team structure different, or the titling different, and is the pace different? So we don't have the data yet because very few have reached 1,000 employees plus kind of mark, but it will come for sure, and we will definitely update the work. And that's also very important thing for Index Press in general. We're trying to tackle evergreen topics that will always, that will require constant update and will be constant questions from founders. On the AI topic itself, even if you look at the data, because in the data set, there are kind of two cohorts of companies. There's like the older cohort that have been created 15, 20 years ago. And then there's a younger cohort that's been created in 10 years ago. And already there, we were actually expecting to see pretty significant differences in the team structures and the way they scaled. And actually, and we even had in the team plan app, we had a ticker where we could select either the old cohort or the new cohort, or both cohorts together. And we actually removed it because there was no difference. And so even though clearly technology has changed and has improved, and you've got Slack, and you've got a lot of new tools and so on that appeared in the meantime, the structure and composition and the shape of the teams hasn't really changed, across those, between those two cohorts. What has changed though is the speed at which these companies got to 500 employees. The first cohort, the older cohort, it took about 8 years. The younger cohort, it took 5 years, and so that was clearly a difference. And to a large extent, supported by technology that makes it, I think supported by two main things. One is supported by technology that makes growth, potentially much faster. The second one is really supported by talent and people who have had the experience of growing a lot faster. Both founders and kind of early operators that are now doing it again and again and again. If you look at a company like Wiz, so Asaf was at our event on Monday, the CEO of Wiz. Wiz is the fastest growing software company in history. And it's only been possible for him to grow and his team to grow so fast because he had done it before at Adalom, got acquired, went to Microsoft, saw what scale looked like. And then when he started Wiz from the get-go, organize himself for that very fast scales and reach north of 100 million ARR in the first 18 months, which had never been achieved before from a standing start. And so, I think that's what we're going to see. And I think at some point we will, and I think AI will be another set of tools that will accelerate the pace even further. All of this innovation, they don't replace one another, they build on top of one another. And so I think this acceleration is definitely going to happen. My view though is I think we're going to, first of all, I still think the shape and the overall need for talent is still going to be there, and I think AI will just mean people work are more productive and do better quality of work and more work. But if your business is working, you still want to grow really, really fast. If your product is selling and your economics are good, you still want to hire the salespeople. I don't think AI will replace all the salespeople. I think it will make them more productive. But will you hire fewer salespeople, or will you hire as many as you can? But grow even faster because they are 3x more productive than they would have been 10 years ago. I think our recommendation will be hire as many as you possibly can. I think that touches on my point, which is I think the limit we're going to reach is not going to be a technological limit. It's going to be a people limit. And that's why also this book is about, which is about helping you grow as fast as you can while not breaking everything up, which is obviously the big challenge. And I think Kevin used the analogy of a sports car kind of race, and you are the driver of a sports car. You need to drive as quickly as you can, but not get off piste. And that's really and one of the limits is obviously the engine. The other is just physics and the ability of the driver. And the engine can be 10x more powerful, but it won't mean you will be able to drive 10x faster because you just won't be able to handle it. And I think that's a little bit the situation we're in here, where clearly the engine is getting really, really powerful and will keep on getting more powerful. But the time it takes to hire a great person, to onboard them, to bring the culture, to create the processes, that at some point we're going to reach just a human limit. And that's going to, which I don't think we'll be able to compress a lot more than than 5 years. I mean, maybe it's going to be 4 years, maybe 3 years. But it's not going to be 3 months. I don't think I don't believe.
Yeah, that would be scary. 3 months. I think that would be the messy beginning, middle, and end. I believe, and I love the analogy used in the book around surfing the chaos, because I think that's also very, apt. You have to be able to, the chaos is there. There's not a way to avoid that entirely. You're going to have some level of chaos, no matter how thoughtful you are, no matter how intentional and effective you are. There will always be layers of chaos, and so you have to be able to navigate that. You have to be able to not get derailed by that. And Sandra, I want to come to you on the next question around, obviously, you have a deep understanding of the findings from the book. You have a massive data set to have reviewed. You have the team plan out to leverage, as we all do. Thank you. But how will this impact how you see your role in terms of kind of, advising and guiding and supporting index portfolio companies with this new data and understanding that you have?
For us, it really underlines the importance that talent has in your growth journey, right? It just shows that every single conversation you have has to revolve around talent and having the right people in your organization. And it's like a core part of everything we already do and we already talk about. People really sit at the core of everything we do here at Index. And so we'll simply continue to deepen the talent offer. So we'll be able to give heads of people much more insights and an additional layer of advisory that you don't get from the app and the book. just simply because we have more data and have better insights to make the decisions. But the functionality we can also think about in the future in team plans, like should there be additional business models? Like Martin says, should we have an AI first or AI only cohort? Should we think about in a couple of years refreshing it with companies in different business models in different markets? So there's a lot more resources that can come out and that we will adapt and continue, I think, on this journey of making sure that the ecosystem can benefit from it.
Well, last question, probably most important question for the audience. Where can people get their hands on both the book and the Team Plan app?
So on the Index Ventures website, there is a section called Index Press where everything is available, again, for free, for download. And otherwise, they can also just go to scalingthroughchaos.com where, again, the same resources are available. They can obviously also, there's an option to leave feedback, which we would love to have. So, if you use the app, if you read the book, if you can give us any feedback on the website, it would be super helpful. Or just kind of reach out to us on LinkedIn. Dom and I, so Dom who kind of authored the book. We had a LinkedIn live session yesterday, kind of demoing the app and talking a little bit about the findings. So you can find that online, and if you want to comment and ask questions there, we'll be very happy to answer them almost real time.
And Lars, you've probably gotten the question as often as I have this week, is like the physical copy of the book will hopefully be available. You can go on the website and join the wait list so that when we publish it and send out physical copies, you can put your name down there.
Okay. Well, great. Well, I will have a link to download both and access both in the show notes of the podcast. So you can hop over there when you're done watching or listening and access it that way. But Martin, Sandra, thank you so much for making time to give us an inside look at scaling through chaos. And again, just from the HR and founder industry, thank you very much on the open source side. This is going to be a great resource for everyone to leverage, and appreciate you making that available for us.
Thank you, Lars, and really thank you for promoting it and sharing it with your community. I hope it's helpful.